Hi, I'm Johns Hopkins with the nonprofit organization Baltimore Heritage, and this is the second video that we're doing in partnership with the folks at Hopkins Medicine to hopefully help you as you're deciding whether to come to Hopkins, whether to move to Baltimore, to help you make that decision by talking a little bit about some of the neighborhoods where you might live. In our first video, I think we covered 3 neighborhoods: Locust Point, Federal Hill, and Canton. Today we're going to try to cover 3 more. We're a city of 250 neighborhoods, so we're just putting a little dent, but you got to start somewhere. All right, here we are at our first stop, Patterson Park, which is really like a big cluster of neighborhoods in East Baltimore. It goes all the way up to right next to the Hopkins Medical Campus. Loads of Hopkins folks live here. It got its name from a gentleman named William Patterson, who gave over a plot of land in the early 1800s, really as a commemoration of our victory over the British in the War of 1812. If you are from the UK and you're applying to Hopkins, we love you. Back then, not so much, but today we love you. Patterson, incidentally, is known because he's got a park named after him, but he may be better known as the father of Betsy Patterson, who married Napoleon's brother. That's right, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. The emperor annulled the marriage. He wanted his brother to marry into European nobility. Betsy spent a number of years fighting it, eventually gave up and moved back here, but hers is not a sad story. She amassed a real estate fortune and is said to have been the first self-made woman millionaire in America, so pretty neat there. Today, the neighborhoods around the park all share the park as their sort of front yard. 25 years ago, if you told me you were going into the park, especially at night, I would have known that you were up to no good. Today, it is a completely different story. The park has turned around thanks to lots of people, lots of effort. Today, if you said you're going into the park at night, you might be going as part of an Audubon bird watching group. The Audubon Club has its headquarters here. They come in at night for owl watches and at dusk to watch the thousands of chimney sweeps amass and then shoot down the chimneys and spires of churches right around the park. Or you might be going to the Friends of Patterson Park, a great volunteer group, one of their wine at sunset happy hours, or on the hillside behind me, especially in the summer, jazz concerts, reggae concerts, and the like. During the day, if you come in here, you might be as part of a softball league or a soccer league, maybe to go ice skating. There's a year-round ice skating rink here too. Or to the chagrin of the park's tennis players, you might be here to play the new fad sport pickleball, which is taking over tennis courts here in the city, and I'm sure, of course, I'm sure all over the place. So really lots and lots of activities going on here. There are weekend activities. 2 of my favorites are the annual neighborhood flea market. Loads of junk, of course, but sometimes pretty cool junk. And then the festival Dia del Nino, which is actually 2 days, but celebrating Baltimore's Latin communities. We don't have as big a population as, say, Los Angeles or Austin, Texas, but we've got a fairly sizable Latin population with clusters around the city, including here where Spanish will be the first language you hear in the shops and restaurants and on the streets. So a neat festival for sure every spring here. And then, of course, in the morning and in the evening, you will be surrounded by dogs and lots of dog walkers here. In fact, in the peak canine hours, there are way more dogs than people in the park. I'd be willing to bet. If you lived here, you would probably be living in a row house converted into apartments. I'm not sure there are any apartment buildings even in Patterson Park. Maybe there's one that I don't know about. But you'd be living in a row house here, treating this as your front yard. It's mostly a set of residential neighborhoods, but there are some local neighborhood bars and pubs. You were right next to Fells Point, the sort of bar restaurant capital of Baltimore, next to Canton the other direction, which we talked about in the last video, and then over to the east, a neighborhood called Highlandtown, which is one of the hubs for Baltimore's Hispanic community. There is one place I'd love to mention, which I'm sure you will end up, and that's called the Ministry of Brewing. It is a former enormous church converted into a microbrew pub. I said, I think in the first video, that we were good at reusing old buildings. Well, this is one of our better reuses, no doubt. I will wrap up by saying, well, what's behind me? Where am I? I'm in the park, and behind me is the observatory. It was erected in the 1890s, and it was modeled after a pagoda at Kew Gardens, the Royal Gardens in London, which in turn was modeled after a pagoda in Nanjing, China. China, which unfortunately has been demolished. It is what's called an architectural folly. It never really served any purpose. It's not a lookout of any kind or anything like that. It's just something pleasing to look at as you're strolling around the park. So with that, I'm going to say let's head on over to our second neighborhood, Mount Vernon. All right, we are on our second stop, the Mount Vernon neighborhood. I'm here at the heart of it, 4 public squares, wonderful historic public squares. If you are wondering where Mount Vernon got its name, it is not to be confused with George Washington's Mount Vernon in Virginia, although that is in fact how it got its name. The guy who owned this parcel here back in the 1700s was the aide-de-camp to General Washington in the Revolutionary War, and when the war was over, he was in love with George, so much so that he came back here and named his own estate after George's. He named streets after battles of the Revolution, Lexington and Saratoga, for example, and he even allowed the enormous monument to George Washington that's behind me to be put up on his estate at a time when everybody else in the city said, don't put it anywhere near me, it is going to topple over in the first strong wind. As a somewhat of an aside, the monument was completed in 1829. It was the first real monument to George Washington in the country, and it was done by the same architect who later went on and did the one down in Washington, D.C. At almost 200 years old, it has not toppled yet, so I think we're safe. But we're no longer building monuments to George Washington in this neighborhood, or I think anywhere in Baltimore. So what happens here? Well, if you take the light rail, it will tell you you're going to get off at the cultural center. I think some other neighborhoods would disagree, but Mount Vernon certainly is a cultural hub in the city. It's got one of our 3 major art museums, the Walters Art Museum. The Peabody Institute is here, a graduate program for musicians, now part of Hopkins. Baltimore's art school, the Baltimore School for the Arts High School, is here, where, among other things, Tupac Shakur got his start. We're kind of proud of that. And there's music everywhere. As a small aside, when I first moved here, it was night and snowing, and I was helping a friend of mine shovel her sidewalk out in front, and we both stopped and were struck by a flute music coming out of an open window down the street. And then up the street, there was an aria coming out of an open window, and around the corner, a guitar player doing his thing. Really, really wonderful snowy evening here in Mount Vernon. But you really know that it is the cultural capital because there are more Indian restaurants than any other neighborhood in the city, for sure. The other thing about Mount Vernon is that it is one of, say, 3 or 4 gayborhoods in Baltimore. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it had a number of gay-friendly bars and restaurants at a time when there was open hostility to the LGBTQ community. There's not the same type of hostility today. In fact, Maryland was, I think, the second state to adopt a marriage equality law. We certainly don't have any of those ludicrous bathroom laws that some other places have. But there still is a hub of LGBTQ folks here. In fact, this is where the annual Pride Festival happens. An organization that's now called the Pride Center is located here, and we still have some wonderful old school gay bars like Leon's, which I think still has no windows. That's reportedly where Liberace would hang out when he came to Baltimore. If you lived here, you'd be lucky to live on the square, one of the squares here. But sorry, probably not. These are really hard to get. But no matter where you lived, it probably would be an enormous row house converted into apartments, 15-foot ceilings, intricate plasterwork, wonderful heart pine flooring. They're really real gems here in Mount Vernon. And where would you eat? Well, in addition to the Indian places, you would definitely go to Afghani places, Ethiopian places, old school Italian places, new school French places, loads and loads to walk to here. And finally, I know a number of evenings you would end up at Spirits of Mount Vernon, the wine store and wine bar that is, in many people's minds and hearts, the real center of the neighborhood. About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it was threatened to be demolished, and a group of about 50 neighbors came together over the course of a weekend, formed a limited liability company, pooled their money, some big checks, some little checks, and bought the building and then rehabbed it, and in went Spirits of Mount Vernon, literally a wine bar owned by neighbors. That's what kind of neighborhood it is. All right, let's go on over to our third stop, Charles Village. All right, here we are at our last stop, Charles Village, the Charles Village neighborhood. And if you want to get a sense of what it's like, think of a college town, but in the form of an urban neighborhood. It's where the Hopkins Homewood campus is. That's where I think all of the undergraduates are, but a number of graduate programs. And then some far out things like the Space Telescope Science Institute, where I bet right now there are people monitoring computer screens guiding the James Webb Telescope to the outer reaches of the galaxy. But back here on planet Earth, Charles Village, Baltimore, things go on like what you might expect to go on a college campus. There are coffee shops full of earnest students wearing black turtlenecks, debating whether the Hegelian dialectic actually influences our social consciousness. There are pizza places where you can get a whole pie or just a slice. There are happy hour bars where there are 2-for-1 specials or even 3-for-1 specials. There are the ubiquitous burrito places where for $7 or so you can walk out with a bean and cheese burrito the size of a football. Maybe my favorite restaurant, at least, is a place called Nifty 50s. It's been here for quite a while. And somehow it really does a good job of delivering both meatloaf, American diner meatloaf, and say lamb vindaloo from India. It's part diner, part Indian restaurant. If you lived here, one of the neat things is that the campus kind of bleeds right into the residential neighborhood. So you'll have professors living next to students, living next to people who have no affiliation at all with the university. They just like the eclectic neighborhood, and I'll bet likely contribute to its eclecticness. If you lived here, your transportation options would be wonderful in the sense that the Hopkins shuttle zips around all through this set of neighborhoods over to the medical campus and back. I would be willing to bet you would be riding that, if not on a daily basis, certainly on a regular basis. All right, I'm going to wrap up here and say that I hope that this has been helpful as you consider what your next move is going to be. I think at the end of our last video, I suggested if you wanted to get to know Baltimore, come on down and sit on a bus stop bench and strike up a conversation with somebody next to you. That's, I think, still a good advice, but you could also go over to Patterson Park, especially during dog walking hours, and strike up a conversation there. Or in Mount Vernon, certainly go to the Spirits of Mount Vernon, have a glass of wine, and ask about the latest neighborhood gossip. Here, I was tempted to say, come on over to one of the coffee shops, and you can definitely do that, but you might risk a philosophy major in a sour mood. So maybe better, go to the neighborhood grocery store on St. Paul Street and ask people what they think about their neighborhood here in Charles Village. All right, thanks so much and good luck making your choice.